Hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining our virtual roundtable today. First of all, I would like to thank Central Asia Program for hosting us today. But I also want to repeat that this is the second launch of this book, Researching Central Asia. For those of you who haven't seen it, we're going to repost the link in a second, which has been co-edited by Aycan Chashinova and me. And the first launch has happened in November at the OSCE Academy, which was organized by my beloved co-editor, Aycan Chashinova, who's here as well. So, as already discussed previously in the previous launch, the main idea of this book came up during a lunch gathering between Aycan and me in Bishkek last year. We were talking and exchanging about our previous experiences of researching Central Asia. And we somehow figured out that even though we had a lot of things in common, some stuffs were quite similar, other stuff less, we noticed that there has been written some articles, single essays, or sometimes even reflective pieces as parts of PhD theses, but there has never been a collection of diverse stories, and not just stories, but reflective pieces in which various researchers and practitioners reflect about their experiences of conducting research in and on Central Asia. And this was the main motivation, was to bring together a variety of voices and scholars and practitioners and combine to talk about one particular aspect of research, and in doing so reflect as well about the positionality and offer guidance for other scholars or practitioners, policymakers, human rights activists who are working in and on the region. So today we have 4 authors here. And also I forgot to mention, usually Sebastian is hosting this kind of roundtable events, but unfortunately can't make it today. So I will be a host and at the same time a speaker. But I want not to take too much time anymore. I want to hand over to our first speaker, who is also my beloved co-editor, Aycan Chashinova. Dr. Aycan Chashinova is the Executive Director at Crossroads Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan, and a research fellow at the Foreign Policy Centre, UK. She holds a PhD in politics, awarded at the University of Leeds. Aycan has recently completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the OSCE Academy in Bishkek, where she researched Russian policies in Central Asia. Aycan has published extensively on Central Asia's relations with the EU, Russia, and China, as well as on domestic Kyrgyz politics. In addition to her academic career, Aycan has worked in the international development area, including the UN system in the Middle East. Aycan, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning for, I guess, the American colleagues. Thank you so much for joining us today. And as Jasmine said, this is a product of a lunch roughly 13 months ago that took place in Bishkek 13 months ago. And I think it probably kicked off when we sat down and I faced the wall and I told Jasmine that I'm facing the wall to avoid being seen with a foreigner. And I think that was a bit amusing for Jasmine to hear. And I realized that was something that I've been practicing for the last 15 years, actually, without thinking. And that was the first time I actually spelled it out, that I'm deliberately facing the wall to avoid being identified or seen with a foreign researcher. So that was one of the insights, and I think it came at the right time as well, because Jasmine was in the middle of her field work with a very difficult topic as well, very sensitive too. So, and I'm a political scientist too. I mostly work on Central Asian politics, a lot on Kyrgyz politics. I've lived through 6 presidents of the Kyrgyz Republic with varying degrees of inclinations towards democracy or autocracy. So it's been an interesting journey to be a political scientist within this interesting dynamic community. I imagine some of my colleagues around the region do not have the freedoms I have enjoyed so far, but things are getting slightly worse in Kyrgyzstan. We have to admit that. So it was good timing to reflect on what's been going on in the region in general, but also in Kyrgyzstan in particular. And I wanted to focus on something that I found very hard to acknowledge, because I felt that it undermines my integrity as a researcher. I felt that acknowledging that I'm actually self-censoring is something shameful. But then I realized I'm not alone. And thankfully, there are quite a few publications, brave Central Asian women again, who are talking openly about their experiences and various aspects of self-censorship that they have to practice to survive, not just as researchers, but also as female or Central Asian people. So it felt like getting naked spiritually writing this chapter, but I thought someone has to do this at some point, and as I said, some of the ladies had done that before me, so I just joined the crowd. And actually in Kyrgyzstan, as I said, it has become a bit more difficult to talk about political affairs as openly as before. And I felt that before we would talk, we would criticize, we were very much vocal, at least the big part of the community of political scientists are quite vocal and critical of the ruling government. But only in the last 2-3 years that we have felt that it's not as safe as before. And if before we were treated as, we have a saying, a dog barks and the caravan carries on. So it felt like we were the dogs who were barking at the caravan, and nobody paid attention to us, but now we feel seen, but not in a good way. So it started feeling a bit more dangerous to speak freely and openly. And I realized that we still thrive even within these conditions, and we still find ways to protect ourselves, whether the danger is perceived or real. And we learn to learn as well from each other how to do that. Persecution of academics, unfortunately, is not a recent phenomenon. Again, in Kyrgyzstan, this is fairly recent. In the rest of Central Asia, it has been happening since the early 90s. You might have heard about Central Asia Political Exile database compiled by the University of Exeter. I went through that one, and I think they have data for about 30 years, if I'm not mistaken. And I identified at least 2 academics who have been detained and who had to flee their countries due to concerns, due to their work. Safety concerns are very much linked to the positionality of each researcher as well. So it depends, I guess, what we face, depends on who we are. Again, as an anthropologist, depending on which type of anthropology you work on, you probably are less exposed to that. If you are into history, again, it depends what history you research and how it could be utilized by the government. But for political scientists, it's quite straightforward. You are likely to be critical of the government, you are likely to say something that would be perceived wrongly, you are likely to get persecuted somehow. The degree of persecution, of course, varies. It could be as mild as a reprimand in your home university, which is not too bad. And I'm pretty sure quite a few of us in public universities especially have faced that. Or it could be as extreme as the case of my lecturer from the Kyrgyz Russian Slavic University, Professor Madat Kazakbayev, who wrote a small media piece a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago, and he was detained by the security services, and he died in custody a year later. So it can be quite extreme. We're still not sure what exactly happens to Professor Kazakbayev, what exactly caused such an extreme reaction from the part of the authorities, and what's been happening for this year within during his detainment or arrest. Safety can be, again, perceived, real. I prefer to be on the safe side, possibly because I'm a female researcher as well. So we grow up learning to be safe, and it's just a million of little ways to keep ourselves safe and our families proud, so to say. And I tried to dig into this, but honestly, I think you need to write a whole new book, guidelines on how to stay safe, on how to behave, or what to do, what not to do. And it is quite restricting, but I only touched on the top of the iceberg. So some of the strategies that I discuss in my chapter are quite small, like facing the wall, as I said. They can be as silly as preferring to use English only in hope that the security services or the politicians I would be critical of wouldn't be able to read that, or it just wouldn't get onto the radar of their attention. It could be something more rigid. For example, if I'm doing field work, I'm reporting back every single morning to my family, or somebody who cares, colleagues or supervisors or co-authors, what I'm doing, where I'm going, whom I'm meeting on that day. and I try to leave as many breadcrumbs as possible, partially because you don't always feel secure when doing field work, especially if you travel around. What else? Self-censorship is very much a part of life, and it's become very much unconscious. And to be honest, I think I started practicing self-censorship as early as 2007, when I wrote my first paper as a student, bachelor student. I don't remember what exactly I was cutting out, but I was focusing on democracy in Kyrgyzstan under President Bakiyev. And these were the most brutal times in a way. That was the bloodiest times because quite a few political dissidents, journalists, businessmen, underworld kings have been killed within a very short period of time. So we didn't feel safe at all, but I knew nobody's going to read my piece. Nobody reads bachelor students' essays. But still, I felt that if I am too critical, I wouldn't get published, and I was desperate to get my thoughts out. It wasn't for the society, it was mostly for me. But I remember the sticky feeling that you have when you have to sort of compromise and decide what you can, what you cannot say, how you say it, how you frame it, how you name it. And I feel that quite a few people going through the same across the world, especially in our neck of the woods. I imagine it's quite challenging even for our Russian colleagues who probably disagree with the war, even in terms of labeling, whether you call it a war or a situation or a crisis or special military operation. So it's a lot of landmines that researchers like myself have to avoid. And it can be quite suffocating, it can be quite challenging, and you still can get it wrong because the way you think might be different from the way the security services might think or the way your management might think. But we still have to do that. And I think I find it quite reassuring that it's still possible to publish something in Kyrgyzstan. But what I do is I choose a variety of different outlets to do that. So I keep academic criticism of academic work very theoretical and very difficult to reach because it's protected by paywalls, it's protected by a very complicated language. So this is where you can be as open as possible, but you sort of do it between the lines. I also try to publish media articles, which are easier to understand and they can be punchy, but I sort of ration myself. So I don't do this very often. I only do this when I reach a certain point where I cannot keep it inside anymore. So I have to publish. And yeah, so it's very extreme cases when I actually go out and publish something publicly and something critical as well. But so far, so good. I mean, I made it to the end of 2023 without any repercussions. I still don't feel like I'm being watched or anything like that. Hopefully that continues, but I did talk to quite a few of my fellows around the region, and to be honest, that feeling of insecurity, that icky feeling that you cannot talk as much as before and you have to be careful about what you talk, it is very much widespread, and my subjective feeling that it is increasing. And especially with the new legislations and pieces in place as well, such as the Foreign Agents Law, the law on disinformation, so on and so forth, it is getting a bit uncomfortable to speak. It is getting uncomfortable to do our work, but we carry on. And it is quite rewarding to see each other, to talk to each other, to have these conversations like this, where we exchange opinions and we exchange our strategies of survival. So it's not all doom and gloom. I believe in our resilience, but it is getting a bit difficult in the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ayjan. I mean, that's a that was very, very interesting. And also, I just want to mention here, because we have two chapters actually in this book, which have been written by two authors under pen names for exactly similar reasons, right? So it's really important that we talk about this, and we can talk about it more in the Q&A as well, how other scholars, what kind of measures we have to take, right, in order to not just protect ourselves, the families in the region, but also our interlocutors and everything. So it's a really important topic. Thank you so much, Ayjan, for speaking about it and so openly as well. Thank you. Now we're going to move to Alexa Kurmanov. Alexa Kurmanov is a doctoral candidate in the anthropology department at the University of California, Berkeley. Their research focuses on LGBTQ and feminist activism in Kyrgyzstan through the lens of Black feminist theorization and methods of intersectionality. In particular, they explore the ways in which the category of woman in post-socialist/post-colonial Kyrgyzstan is reconstructed by state and public discourse. Furthermore, how the category of woman cuts through class, race, and space, and how local LGBT and feminist communities navigate, contest, and articulate notions of gender and sex in the everyday. And she's going to talk about her chapter in the book, in which is obviously connected as well to Black feminism and her positionality.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this panel and to be able to speak about my experience in Kyrgyzstan as a researcher, as an anthropologist. Yes, my chapter, which is entitled A Stranger in the Village, Anti-Blackness in the Field. Basically, the goal of this chapter was to speak directly to undergrads. So it's really for everyone to read, but the audience that I had in mind when I was writing it was specifically to the undergraduate population, and in particular, Black undergrads. And I kind of see, now that I've reread the article a couple of times, each time we do, a panel or I talk to someone about it, I've come to realize that it really was kind of maybe a therapeutic activity for me, and as well as kind of maybe a letter that I would have written to, my younger academic self at the time. So yes, each time I talk about this essay, I feel like there's something new to talk about that I didn't touch on the time before. There's many themes that kind of run throughout the essay, which touch on how the body and our bodies are perceived across different cultural contexts, how perhaps some identities become articulated, whereas others are not, or maybe it's the combination of both. In particular, for me in this article, it revolves around race and sexuality. So not only am I Black, but I'm non-binary and I'm queer. And so, what does that mean in this space, and how do people read me in this space, whether I want them to read me as such or not, and also, in this article, this particular article, which like I said, was kind of geared towards more of the undergrad population, I just wanted to touch on the tensions that one may face when they're abroad. At times, it's very difficult, and I think institutions are doing better now than they were before, but I think there still remains an issue with access to understanding how race is perceived, especially in post-socialist contexts. And that can be very, how can I put it? There's an element, of course, of culture shock, right? But how do we help students of color, queer students, Black students flourish when they are abroad on study abroad programs, or when there's younger scholars who are doing their field work? How do we not only get them there, but also help them to flourish while they're there? And just kind of prepare them for the things that they may face. So in my article, like I said, I kind of touch on, instead of, kind of the spectacular violence that one may be used to when we talk about conversations revolving around anti-Blackness, right? Like the physicality of it, the gratuitous violence of it, as Wilderson would call it. But yeah, I'm more interested in the fatigue. So I talk about it through Black fatigue, kind of this experience of mundane violences that happen in the everyday, that seem very innocent. And I thought, like, when I wrote this, it was an awesome opportunity to also be in dialogue with Black studies, right? Because that's my whole thing. So I took this as an opportunity to kind of exercise that and see what would flourish or come out of it. So I basically use James Baldwin's 1953 essay, A Stranger in the Village, where he visits the Swiss Alps. He's trying to have a reprieve from American racism, but he finds himself up in the Swiss Alps and he's dealing with these very mundane, innocent, elementary forms of racism. And he's just like, how is this happening? Basically, I mean, I'm being very like, reductive here, but he's questioning, he's having this kind of push and pull with the people who are in this particular village. And he's, you can see him kind of oscillating between pleasantness and rage in his writing. And he's kind of having to figure out how to balance this because he understands that, okay, these people are also like, one, where is this coming from? But also, these people don't really, they touch my hair, they say that I am like tar, but like, where are they getting this from? And it is in such an innocent way. So I wanted to use his work just to also highlight how theoretically rigorous his work is. It's not just a travel literature, it's not just an essay, but it is theoretically rigorous, and it is using particular frameworks in order to antagonize not only the fact that racism is not just a place that is an American, it's not just an American thing, but he can also go back to Europe and be encountering these types of or forms of racism. So I thought that he was also like kind of questioning and poking at the same questions that I always have, whereas how can I go 6,000 miles away from my home and then also face similar questions about, or questions about where I'm from, where I'm really from, not that I'm, that I have to be from Africa, right? Like I was born there. Sometimes people don't believe me when I say I'm American, which I find very interesting. But where did these like stereotypes come from and how do they follow me across cultural contexts when I think, okay, I'm going to Kyrgyzstan and I'm going to find some reprieve from the everyday shenanigans that I deal with in the US, but here we are, full circle sometimes. So I talk about that. And I also have a section where I think I needed to kind of lay to rest something that happened when on my first visit to Kyrgyzstan, and kind of talk about the connection between this kind of Black fatigue and fetishization that comes along with it and what comes out of that. So in one section, I do talk about the experience of a Nigerian man who was here. His name is Aliyah Abubakar. He had been here for more than a decade. People actually I think he was pretty well known around Bishkek. Bishkek is not that big. You could run into the same person twice in one day, probably here. And so he had been living here for a while, and he had been shopping one day in the summer looking for, I think it was a tablet for his daughter. And someone decided that they wanted to take a video of him, basically. And granted, I thought, well, this is probably not the first time that someone has taken a video of him or a photo of him, because it certainly has happened to me multiple times while being here. And on that particular day, he had a reaction towards it, right? Asked the person to stop doing it, and it ended up being an altercation in which he was killed by the other person. So I think in this instance, I was also not only concerned with stating his name, because he's not a name that is typically a part of our American movements like Black Lives Matter, right? But also, I was more concerned with the moments that led up to his death, not the actual moment of it. So this kind of fetishization, and when it becomes something that is dangerous, or something that is physical. So I've put that in as well to kind of think about that, the connections between everyday mundane violence, or these kind of elementary forms of racism, or you know, internalized white supremacy at the most, I guess, and how they can formulate into something that is actually very violent, and can be very physical. And then in conclusion, I do admit at the end of the article that, you know, talking about these very sensitive subjects, right, about Blackness in this space and how one's body is perceived in this space as a Black person, can encourage, I guess, discourses of danger, and maybe discourage people from actually doing research in Central Asia. And that's not, and I say is not my intent to do that, because I think that would also reinforce kind of some of the greatest American propaganda for Black people, which is that you're not safe anywhere abroad, but you're safer at home, which I don't think is true, in a lot of ways. So, you know, I do at the end kind of wrap around and try to think about, and highlight the importance of actually, you know, going abroad, and that it's okay as, you know, a Black student, as a queer student, to study Central Asia, or to, you know, be in collaboration with scholars in Central Asia. But also, because I also want to state, I think a lot of times Black students who are interested in the region find themselves in a particular situation in which, even if they're trying to have dialogues between both Black studies and, say, Central Asian studies, or somewhere in the post-socialist region, that they find themselves even more isolated, because in seminars, especially in Black studies, there's a particular type of conversation about socialism, which deals more with liberation and can have a lot of blind spots to the realities of actual existing socialism. But then on the flip side, if you go to a class which is in particular on the region, there's no discussion about race or Blackness. So I think I wanted this article to kind of encourage and just show that I exist. My email's at the bottom. People can reach out to me if they need to. I'm here to answer questions. And give and share further my experience, but also to let them know that they don't have to feel isolated. But also the most important point is that I kind of wanted to, again, highlight the importance of, you know, going abroad, but also as a Black person, as a Black student, as a Black scholar, being aware of the imperialism that you also may be carrying with you out of certain spaces. So yeah, that's my article.
Thank you so much, Alexa, for this very fascinating talk, and again for writing this essay. This was such a pleasure to read. And I learned a lot about my own home country as well, which is very interesting. And just to share some news, Switzerland is finally starting to work on its own as a colonial history. They just founded a professorship for history at University of Basel, I think, which is looking at one of the industrial families in Switzerland who has been involved in the slavery trade. So yeah, it's a big thing. Thank you so much, Alexa. So now we are moving on to Dr. Aziz El Morado. He is a research associate at the Department of Politics and Society at the Faculty of Sociology at Bielefeld University. His research interests include the post-Soviet politics against the background of East-West paradigm, political and historical sociology of autocratic politics in Central Asia. Aziz El Moradov is the coordinator of the postdoctoral fellowship program, Institutional Change in Social Practices, Research on the Political System, the Economy and Society in Central Asia and the Caucasus, funded by the Volkswagen Foundation. And Aziz has also written a very interesting and thought-provoking piece for our book, and I'm looking forward to hear your presentation, Aziz, as well.
Thank you. Yes, first of all, thank you, Aycan and Yasmin, for inviting me to join this interesting project. When Aycan first asked me if I was interested to join the efforts, I didn't know what to contribute. Then I realized that there was already something in the air for many years about the problem of academic positionality, something difficult to capture perhaps in definitions, and something that perhaps related to culture, or as intellectuals put it, to the problem of other. So I realized that in my contribution, I could potentially discuss and problematize the knowledge production or epistemological dimension of research, and maybe in doing so, try to relate to the main goal of this special collection, and namely to investigate ethical, personal, and methodological problems researchers face in Central Asia. So in my contribution, I actually focused on ethical and on personal problems that I sometimes face doing research in and on Central Asia. So, but maybe before telling about my experience, I should maybe also highlight that I'm relatively new in the field of sociology of knowledge. I have a background in international relations and political science. And it's only since recent years that I am familiar with different intersections, interesting intersections of theories, post-colonial theory, decolonial, and feminist critique. And I think that despite the fact that there is increasing awareness today in Central Asia about diverse epistemological issues, and despite that, I would still say that the sociology of knowledge is largely under-researched. So I departed from that understanding, and it's a very brief contribution, but nevertheless, I tried to reflect what I have been anyway thinking for the last 2 or 3 years. So exactly, and what I personally often face doing research on Central Asia is not some problem in field research or some methodological problem. What I often face is maybe a more fundamental problem. And it's a problem, perhaps, as I put in my title, of making sense in a more general sense, making sense of knowledge production, and also making sense of terms and conditions under which different modes of knowledge operate. I think it's not some kind of universal matrix of knowledge, uncontested, that is easily accessible to all of us, and we can get the instruments and study everything immediately. I think that's not the case. of course. So the questions that I have been thinking willingly or not willingly for the last few years are more like, how do we acquire knowledge? How do we make certain scientific claims? And when we make these claims, do we as scholars in fact occupy an unambiguous position? Or the question such as what does it take in fact to be knowledgeable about complex social cultural contexts? So as you can see, my contribution is rather informed by theory, but I will try to be more not so boring and maybe make some examples as I proceed. So in other words, I can say that I often face some kind of internal conflict about adequacy or maybe suitability and sufficiency of research tools and instruments, frameworks, methods, approaches in addressing social reality that is rooted in local epistemology. By local epistemologies, I mean local traditions, rituals, practices, faith. For instance, on the one hand, as a political scientist, I should say I may be aware, of course, of defining social problems in the region. But on the other hand, again, maybe more at a personal level in daily life and daily situations when reality offers its different dimensions, I often don't think too much about my academic position, but rather maybe flow in general conventions. Sometimes maybe I even get a certain pleasure in observing local practices and rituals, which, however, if I observe closely, theoretically and academically, they immediately may turn out to be quite problematic. So that's, if you understand what I mean, that's my problem. So this is, on the one hand, a certain kind of social reality pertaining to academic work. On the other hand, social reality as it manifests itself in everyday life. So I often found myself in between those two kind of worlds, and it was quite problematic to operate and also to gain an awareness. Okay, how I can delineate these two worlds, because there is a increasing awareness in post-colonial, decolonial, and feminist critique, but also postmodern critiques, that the social reality of everyday life also matters, and it should be also somehow brought into this paradigm. So in the end of the day, especially when I sit down at my working table, I sometimes end up with self-posed question of what is social about social science, and where is my academic positionality in all this, and perhaps also most importantly, whether or not I should demonstrate a strong academic position, or is it also sometimes fine not to have one? These are the questions that I have, but clearly I don't have an obvious answer to none of these questions. That's why my title, in my work, I operate with words like ambivalence and uncertainty. That's indeed the case so far. And maybe with examples, there have been many different examples since recently. I've been looking into tradition, for example, and religion also a little bit, and against the background of modernity. So on the one hand, I have my own biases, but today I think I would not like to talk about my biases, but they definitely exist. But what is really interesting to observe in this context is that it seems to me that in today's script of modernity, elements of the traditional and elements of the religious, for example, as soon as, let's say, they manifest themselves as material exhibits in museum, or they are celebrated in colorful festivals, it's fine. However, once these elements of the traditional and the religious are also self-conscious speaking elements, it may get quite problematic. That's the point. And also my observation is that, I mean, that's the point with the modernity. And also my observation is that in a similar manner, somehow, the so-called locals or outsiders or underrepresented in academia, there is increasing call for inclusion in academia for them, but at the same time, this inclusion is also in a certain sense based on exclusionary practice, as I just told with the example of tradition and religion. I mean, I told that it's good as far as they are exhibited in a museum or celebrated in festivals. And in academia also, even though there are indeed a lot of publications, but I think still it's more at the level of this general call for inclusion. And especially in Central Asian context, it's there is very little work, and I'm very happy that this is one of the first works that takes the task very seriously and brings so many interesting insights. I also, as Aijan told when I was reading the individual chapters, I was very how can I say it, surprised to see such diverse perspectives, and also I'm very hopeful as a result that this work should be continued, and this work should be continued. So I just hope that I was not too theoretical, because I know I operated with some words like in a broad manner. So, but as those who are already familiar with the literature, this is a very broad literature anyway. If they are familiar, I was basing my points on tradition and modernity paradigm. So I didn't want to go into details about that, but I'm sure most of you are familiar. And yeah, if you have any questions, we can. I can try to answer in more detail as we proceed. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I'll probably step in because it's a bit awkward if Jasmine presents herself. We were supposed to have Sebastian to do that, but unfortunately he couldn't make it. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jasmine Dalinyola. She's a postdoctoral visiting scholar at the George Washington University at the School of International Affairs, Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. She has a PhD in politics and international relations from Oxford Brookes University. And she focuses actually on the relationship between technology, surveillance, and governance in authoritarian societies. So it's very, very sensitive topic. So her research has been published widely in peer-reviewed academic journals, and she's also an editor for short content at the Central Asian Survey. So in case if you work on Central Asian affairs, Jasmine is the person to go to if you want to publish something short and sweet. Jasmine?
Thank you so much. Wait, can everyone hear me? Yes, cool. Thank you so much, Aijan, for the nice introduction, and everyone. So as we already discussed today, every author of this book looked at one particular aspect of fieldwork. And since I work on surveillance and technologies, I'm looking at one particular aspect of technology connected to cyberstalk in my chapter. And I start this chapter very unusual with a story of Yelena. Yelena is a 19-year-old woman who has been sexually harassed by a 60-year-old man, Peter, in a public bus coach somewhere out in a little village, but I'm not saying where. And pretending that she doesn't know that she doesn't know Peter's mother language and doesn't know how to speak it, Yelena somehow manages to ward off her harasser and escape the situation of sexual harassment with Peter. And many of my female interlocutors in Central Asia can sympathize with Yelena's stories because sexual harassment of teenage girls and women in public transport is pervasive in Central Asian societies. And this is on the next slide. However, upon revealing that I am Jelena and that I became the victim of sexual harassment in a small city in the countryside of Switzerland, my female respondents tend to be speechless. And again, somehow in the spirit of decolonization, I decided to start this essay with my own personal experience of sexual harassment in Switzerland to illustrate that the issue of gender-based violence is not just a problem in Central Asia, but everywhere, and especially in European context too. I therefore ask anyone who reads my chapter to not forget that violence against women is a problem everywhere around the world. While I was conducting fieldwork for my postdoc project in Central Asia in 2022, I experienced various forms of sexual harassment. It was for that reason that in my contribution, I decided to choose and to reflect and discuss how this unwanted sexual advances or cyberstalking can impact women scholars' personal and professional lives. And somehow an example of a future research notes as well for those of you who are interested to write for the Central Asian Survey. Similar, this kind of structure of a research note, I structured this chapter into two sections. In the first section, I talk about physical sexual advances and how I've tried to somehow navigate them while I was in Central Asia in particular. And I found that it was particularly my foreign femininity which attracted a lot of attention from both male and female interlocutors, but they reacted differently towards me. So while young women, for example, would use the interview with me as an opportunity to engage in discourses of inclusion and gender equality, most young men in their 20s and 30s would misread my interest in their use of technology as an attempt to flirt with me. To the extent that some men even made physical and sexual advances, others were verbally explicit, and yet others restricted themselves to hints and allusions. So yes, I had men's attention, as previous scholars have written about Central Asia and about the third sex, which usually is somehow attached to foreign, white, or European-looking Western women. But this also had its price. In contrast to Central Asian women who were there for serious courtship and marriage, I was seen as sexually promiscuous and therefore was there for fun. Since my meetings with local men were not really regulated by local gender behavior rules, I was neither protected by these norms nor could I rely on them. Nor would Central Asian men respect my boundaries. And the repeated sexual harassments and advances from gatekeepers and other men in power proved especially challenging in this context, because I needed their support to access the field and my respondents, because outright rejection of their proposal and therefore could have had and harmed both my safety and my research. For example, I mentioned 3 different examples, but I'm not going to talk about all of the 3 now because I really want people to read the chapter for those of you who haven't yet. Because one example which I really like telling, because it's somehow funny, is on one occasion, one of my gatekeepers in one of the Central Asian cities I've been to, Ahmad, he kept on calling me at night. And because he was worried about my physical well-being, because he would mention on several occasions that he was afraid that I would be kidnapped by a man because of my beauty and my looks. And he would even go as far as to introduce me to potential interlocutors, and sometimes just strangers, like as taxi drivers or somehow as Jasmine, the researcher from Switzerland, who at a certain point, because of her beauty, is going to be abducted. And so I always thought of it as a joke, but of course I didn't feel very comfortable because in certain situations, that could happen. But because I didn't want to lose his support, also because it's very difficult to recruit informants and so on and respondents, I kept my emotions and my opinions to myself until the end, until the last meeting where I was very blunt with him. So again, he was saying that I will be abducted and whatever. And in that moment, I replied to him, but Ahmad, my dear father, he would not accept that. And then he would, yeah, but why would your dear father not accept it? He gets money for you, Jasmine. He gets pure money for you. This is great. This is a win-win situation. And I was like, yeah, but I mean, the problem is my father wouldn't accept, if he wouldn't accept like 1 million, whatever local currency it was, he would only accept $1 million US. And if a young man or an older man as well who wants to kidnap me and just disregards my father's condition, he would be introduced to the mafia. And obviously here I was making a indirect reference to my family name, who is Italian. And luckily, thanks to that, Ahmad stopped making those jokes, but I also never saw him again. So this is one of the kind of rather funny anecdotes of sexual harassment and how to navigate. But what I found very useful is sometimes, to just play dumb, try to act like I don't speak the local language when it was very, let's say, outspoken sexualized remarks, for example. And however, the problem is, and this is, I think, one of the main reasons and one of the main things I want to talk about today, is that because we have technologies unfortunately also help harassers and wherever they are from to continue their harassment online. Because some powerful men like Amir, who was a local politician, I found out lately, in one of the Central Asian countries I've been to in 2022, continued their unwanted advances online through the internet long after I had returned to my home country. Amir had used his personal links to the local authorities to obtain my private Swiss mobile phone number against my will. I haven't shared it with him. The fact that during the last 48 hours of my stay in his city, Amir continued to call and text me on WhatsApp and on all of my social media accounts left me in a constant state of fear that Amir would find and abduct me. So Ahmad's threat of a man abducting me suddenly didn't seem so far anymore. Luckily I managed to get around it. I set up a safety protocol with my local friends in the city, as well as my partner in Switzerland. So I agreed with them to watch out for a text message of me as soon as I reach the airport, because there is this kind of short window, especially because we all know when we fly back from Central Asia to Europe or to North America as well, or just in this direction, most of the flights are in early morning, right? So it's this particular window where someone could kidnap you or something could happen, is this window between your place you're staying in and the airport, right? If you have to take a public transport, or if you have to take a taxi. But everything luckily went well, and I made it safely back to Switzerland. Nevertheless, long after I had left his city, Amir kept on calling and texting me, so that I felt forced to block his phone number. But all this did not ward off Amir. On March 8, 2023, I was woken by a text message of Amir, who had gotten himself a Swiss phone number to send me an image of flowers for International Women's Day on WhatsApp. Kind of ironic, right? I was terrified. Why and how did he obtain a Swiss phone number? And was he looking for me in Switzerland? And what could he, as a married man of 2 kids, possibly want from me? Amir's call and message from a Swiss number made me realize that I could delete and block his number. I could reset my phone and change even my phone number, but all this would not prevent him or any other person from just using another phone number or from creating a new fake profile to follow my travel updates and research updates on my public social media profiles in the future. And this is very problematic because often we, as especially early career scholars, are encouraged to engage in public and in networked scholarship, right, on social media. And in this particular moment, cyberstalking highlights the potential and far-reaching consequences that any researcher, but especially women researchers, experience when they have a public social media profile. Moreover, and this is another very important aspect, I think, of cyberstalking, it doesn't only harm researchers' physical and emotional safety, it can also have a negative impact of the researcher's professional career, as I had to unfortunately experience. Because due to Amir's ruthless advances, I had to postpone my planned field trips and to turn down invitation to speak at conferences and venues in Central Asia. As such, cyberstalking does not only have a negative impact on researchers' emotional and physical safety, it also harms the professional career in academia. Early career female scholars in particular are confronted with the paradox of hiding themselves in situations where they are actually assessed according, or professionally assessed according to their on and offline visibility, right? As well as the impact factor, of course, of their publications. So any form of harassment acts to silence and marginalize female scholars' voices and adversely impacts not just their personal and professional life, but also the wider public's access to female scholarship. So what are the main takeaways of my chapter, which is the last slide? So what I wanted to show in my chapter, and in this very reflective and, as we already said, stripping down and getting naked chapter almost, what I wanted you guys to remember is that even when we as young foreign female researchers try to earn engagement ring, to dress modestly, unwanted sexual advances by men in any kind of field, in any kind of context, cannot be precluded. We might belong to a so-called third sex category that grants us easy access to both female and male circles, social circles, but this category does not protect us from sexual harassment. In contrast to local women, in particular, as I've experienced in Central Asia, neither are our encounters with men regulated by local gender behavior rules, nor can we make use of the Central Asian cultural mentality of shame to ward off potential harassers. Moreover, harassment does not necessarily end with the end of the fieldwork, as I unfortunately had to experience. It can continue in the form of cyberstalking and can take an emotional toll on the researcher. In this context, writing, and this is something what already the other speakers have mentioned as well, is this kind of writing experience with this book has helped me a lot in order to deal with this kind of post-traumatic stress disorders. But of course, it's still cyberstalking, and the fact that I've been cyberstalking the way I've been has had an impact, as I mentioned as well, to the way I can travel freely within the region. In addition, what helped me as well is that I spoke out against my stalker on Twitter, which I did, of course, anonymously because I wanted to avoid any lawsuit. And but it was a very nice experience to speak out. I did it on the 8th of March as well to kind of illustrate this irony with this 8th of March post. And to my surprise, everyone was very positively about and reacted very positively about the post. As well, I received a lot of messages from other female scholars talking about their own experiences, not just with cyberstalkings, but also in particular with sexual harassment and as well sexual violence when they were conducting field work in their particular field. So I was contacted by various people, which was really nice to get this kind of feeling of solidarity and exchange, which also shows that we need more training and literature on how to mitigate on and offline harassment for everyone, not just women, for everyone. So, and yeah, what is really interesting is there is a lot of literature out there who says that women who speak out online on Twitter receive a lot of hate. In contrast to that literature, I didn't receive that. So it was a really nice experience. And not even from Amir, who of course continues to follow my updates on all my social media accounts. So thank you so much for your attention. That's somehow my little insight into my chapters. So I would say we open.
Thank you, Janice.
Thank you. So I would say we open the floor for questions. Do we have to answer your questions? Okay, we already have some questions here. I think we're going to start. Is it more dangerous? So the first question we have in the Q&A is it more dangerous to write posts on social media than an article in an academic journal? That's really interesting. How is socialism studied differently in Black studies? I guess that's more for Alexa. But I think for the first question, Aycan, do you want to start first maybe? And then Aziz would be interested to have your perspective as well. And then I will add something afterwards. So is it more dangerous to write posts on social media than an article in an academic journal? What is your personal opinion about that? Aycan.
It depends on where you are, but Kyrgyzstan definitely, because to access an article, you have to buy a subscription. And I mean, we don't do that ourselves. people who might abuse you are not likely to do that anyway. So I think posts are quite dangerous, especially in light of the recent arrests when people in Kyrgyzstan get detained for simply reposting something. So it is very much a danger, at least in Kyrgyzstan.
Aziz?
Yes, thank you for this interesting question. I think, in fact, yes, it may be more dangerous to post something on social media than writing an article. Certainly, these are absolutely different activities, but still, I have examples with self-censorship. Sometimes I write a post that is about a certain social issue in Central Asia or in Uzbekistan, the country I come from. And I spend some time sometimes on this post, but interestingly, sometimes I just don't finish, or sometimes I post and even sometimes I delete. It has more maybe with the practice of self-censorship. So yes, I think it may be dangerous, depending again, also as Aycan told, where you are based.
And I think as foreign scholars, I mean, it might not be dangerous to you physically, right? If you post something, if you make a public statement, but it could have a negative impact on your research participants and the people you're working with or your working colleagues. So this is something we have also to discuss and talk more about. I mean, talk about it in another article where sometimes it might be, we sometimes, even as foreign scholars, have to turn down writing certain pieces. I mean, in my case, I had this, that I couldn't write about a particular protest because I was still in the country. And if I would have done that, all the people who have been talking to me could have been invited to the local security offices, right? So it's this kind of question. So it's important. It's not just local scholars who have to censorship themselves. We have to debate this more and talk more with, especially undergrad students, about, yeah, not just, of course, we are in a freer country maybe, but our posts might harm the people we work with in Central Asia, right? So we have to talk more about this topic, and this is, and how problematic even our posts can be, and what kind of implications they can have for our colleagues or friends in Central Asia, right? Or what do you think about it, Aziz?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I mean, you can answer in so many different ways. I was now thinking, as you told, as you specified, maybe I also need to specify. I mean, what I mean by dangers, it's maybe in a certain way, it's a more imagined danger or perceived danger rather than real danger, but still, the almost in all over Central Asia, there is a perception of a certain danger once you post things or sometimes speak out publicly. So I'm not sure. So it's maybe rather imagine the danger. So you never know who is following you, or if there are some repercussions for your post, but you are certainly not very comfortable still articulating certain social concerns. So that's what I mean, maybe, yeah.
Thank you, Aziz. Alexa, would you like to answer the question, how is socialism studied differently in Black studies? And maybe also the following question, how did you address those mundane forms of racism? How much can we be polite dealing with problems?
Yeah, sure. But I also have something to say to the previous question, which I completely agree with Aycan about in the context of Kyrgyzstan, especially in my research where I'm dealing with very sensitive topics about LGBT issues and dealing with advocacy in this way. I think it's definitely like, before coming, I usually like clean my Instagram basically. Yeah, my Instagram looks very heterosexual right now. Just because I don't know, like, you know, once something gets out and a picture is circulated, then it's out in the digital world, basically. but also just speaking to an experience that happened to me recently as well, where I do English speaking or English talking clubs in different places around the city. And one of the organizations had posted me on TikTok, and it went viral very quickly. So now I'm having to, I mean, the video is hidden, but now I cannot like do anything about how many times it's been shared somewhere else, right? And so now I've been walking around Bishkek basically with like my headscarf on, hoping people don't recognize me, which some people have already recognized me that aren't a part of the community. So I think, yeah, definitely I agree with what Ayjan said earlier about the context of Kyrgyzstan. It's definitely very dangerous here too. But as far as like academic articles, I don't see that as dangerous. But okay, so as far as how socialism is studied in Black studies, so typically it has more to do with like Black studies kind of historical collaboration with or reading of socialism, right? Using theory and whatnot, but it has more to do with liberation. Like I said before, a lot of times people will talk about, of course, Black Panther movement. There's also, you know, the earlier kind of travelers that were going to the Soviet Union from the United States, Black Americans, and actually, some of them were not American, right? Going to the USSR. So it's very much talked about as something that is kind of makes possibility, right? And I think there were possibilities, right, for Black people coming out of Jim Crow America into the USSR. But I think just talking about those particular experiences can obscure, and I've seen it happen where people will use Blackness in order to obscure the USSR's part, or in particular Russia's part, right, in colonizing Central Asia, so, and various other spaces, where they'll say, oh, well, it's raceless because you see Black people kind of were able to be there without dealing with what they were dealing with in the US or in other places outside of the USSR. So I don't know if that answered your question, but it's typically, like I said, it's kind of romanticized in a lot of ways. I could have just said that in short, I guess. As far as how do I deal with mundane forms of racism? Well, mostly mundane forms of anti-Blackness. I want to like just use that word instead. I've learned how to just I'm learning still how to navigate this. I think that it's gonna always be a process for me. But it just depends on who I'm speaking with. Sometimes I don't want to expend my energy to explain that, you know, I can't tell you who my great-great-grandfather is, right? Or where I really come from in Africa before the slave trade. Like I pick and choose where I want to expend my energy at this point. And at times, I just kind of, yeah, like I said, I think I'm still figuring it out, and I'm a pretty nice person, so I'm not gonna like go off on people immediately. I can extend kind of a understanding, right, that maybe people don't have access to those types of knowledges. So I either offer them that, or like I said, I don't expend my energy, and I just say, oh, okay, and I just leave it alone.
Okay, Thank you so much, Alexa. I think the next question is, do you think international organizations, funders of research could step up in supporting female and LGBTQ researchers and helping them mitigate these risks? If yes, how can they do it? John, do you want to start first, and then we maybe go to Alexa as well, right?
Sure. I don't know how they could do this, but possibly funders of research could probably invest a bit of money to help people, not just female and LGBTQ, but generally, if you're like Jasmine and Alexa, if you're coming to an unfamiliar environment, how do you function basically? Because this is something that is not discussed enough. And like Alexa said, she's writing it to address maybe younger people who are just starting their research career, might not be aware. So I think it's very important to ensure that there is information open and honest, or at least like a leaflet, who to call, where to call, how to protect yourself. Like as another case where I didn't feel safe in a taxi, and I just texted the last person I was texting before that, and that was my student actually. And she straight away told me, send me your geolocation and the contact details of the taxi driver. And I didn't think of that because I panicked. So even things like this. So like if you find yourself in a not comfortable situation, like what do you do? Because for me, it was like just panicking and messaging whoever's on the top of my WhatsApp list. So things like that would be very much helpful, I believe. And this is something that doesn't take too much funding. Fairly easy to make, and I'm sure there would be a lot of people who could volunteer and who could contribute their stories or hints and tips. It's, I mean, I shared a couple, you shared a couple, and I'm sure we can build together something bigger.
Kind of running workshops as well, right? Where we do kind of go through examples and situations and try kind of discuss situations, how we could react towards it, and then everyone kind of shares their particular kind of, their rule. I mean, certain aspects like walking home alone, talking to someone on the phone, right? If it's dark, or like in your case with a taxi, it's so natural to a certain extent, to certain people, to others less, right? But if we just exchange and talk about it in forms of workshops and group meetings, and these workshops can be online, but can be offline, and then maybe also, as you said, with a leaflet, to have like certain bullet points out of those workshops, that would be great.
I think, I mean, I can only kind of speak in the context of like, I guess like pre-departure meetings, which I've been to many for study abroad via like various organizations. But I think there just needs to be an element of honesty into what someone is stepping into. Oftentimes I was finding, and I haven't been to a pre-departure meeting lately, right? But I do know, because I do get a lot of undergrads that actually just, either they find me on social media, which I have no idea how they do that, but they find me on social media or they email me. And so they come directly to me now, actually, which is interesting. And so this is telling me that maybe there still is a problem in pre-departure meetings, I guess. I don't know. But there just needs to be more of an element of, I think, just honesty about, okay, you're going into this space as a queer person, as a Black person. And I found actually, it's very hard for me to hide the fact that I'm Black here. That I can't control. But I can control, to an aspect, how I present myself. I realize that not having hair is a trigger for people here a lot of times. And I've been called anything from beautiful to a gay man. So, I have learned to kind of, I just cover my head, or at some point I met John for our first meeting. I had a wig on, which was very interesting. She probably was like, what is happening? But I kind of wanted to see how people's reactions would actually change when I had the wig on instead. So I think like I said, being honest about, this is the cultural context and these things may happen to you. And also when things do happen, because they will, do not gaslight students. I think this is also like a key thing, because this was happening a lot where I would say, okay, this thing happened, I'm not sure. And you're already questioning it because you're again kind of trying to walk this fine line of being polite and then also being upset, right? Or enraged by something. And then you go to a program officer or somebody who's a coordinator, or you go to the funder or whoever it is, and they tell you that race doesn't exist in this context, right? So I think there just needs to be more attention to that as well. It's like, that shouldn't be the first thing that people jump to, but to not invalidate the experience that that person just had. So, yeah.
Just one more thing about, as you said, like you control your appearance. The only aspect you can control is your queerness, right? Because we have one chapter by Marius Honig, which I just want to quickly advertise here, because the person talks about how they are somehow going for this performative heterosexuality, right? Which is also very interesting, and I think it's also very valuable for other queer scholars here in the Q&A, which is very interesting how he talks about how he had to pretend to be a heterosexual man in discussions when others kind of interlocutors would make sexualized jokes about women, and they were kind of expecting him to contribute to those discussions and everything, which brings me to my question, which Aziz already know, and I think he's gonna hate it, is where are the Central Asian male voices here? Because John and I, when we were putting together this edited volume, we wanted to gain also more Central Asian male scholars talking about their positionality and reflecting about their research. So why, and this is a question to everyone here who wants to say something, why are Central Asian male less intrigued so far to talk about their positionality?
Thank you. There may be different reasons, and for that, and I don't want to be now maybe too tough on men, but maybe this there is a finer way of putting this, but I would say not necessarily good, maybe in critical thinking, or I don't know, maybe not interested in critical thinking. That's my experience, that I got feedback sometimes. I get feedback sometimes from male researchers that what I'm dealing, be it post-colonial critique or decolonial, sometimes they simply say, they like to dismiss me by saying, do something scientific. And so you can get the air of condolence, or how you say it, there. So it also first and foremost concerns also gender studies. So Central Asian men, I think, are very bad at this. So unfortunately, whereas I think, in fact, the gender studies and feminist studies and all critical thinking oriented studies, they profit a lot by participation of men in Central Asia. And sometimes I really do think that, in fact, men should be advancing actually the field. But unfortunately, this is not the case so far. I hope that answered your question. I mean, I have very different experience from everyday life situation, but I don't know, yeah.
Thank you so much, Aziz. But what I want to do in order to close the roundtable now is, because Alexa, you mentioned that sometimes it felt like writing a letter to your younger self, right? So writing this chapter felt like writing a letter to your younger selves. So what I want to do now is to basically conclude the main takeaways. And what would you tell your younger self now about academia, or about entering an experience, or about doing research on Central Asia, or in any kind of context? What are your takeaways? What would you tell your younger self? Would you do anything different, or would you do it exactly the way you have done it, basically? I give you some time to think, because that's quite a big question, actually.
I think it's quite an interesting discussion in the chat as well, with different experiences. And I think, yeah, whenever we start opening the the lead, I think a lot of stories actually come out here, because that was my experience as well, especially with the fellow political scientists. Like when you mention, like, I'm freaking out, for example, if I see somebody who's out of space, out of place, doesn't look particularly academic or interested. And they told me most likely those security services. I'm like, how do you know? And they like, well, we are so used to them. We know like the brand of shoes they wear, the shape of baseball hat they wear, the model of the phone they carry. And I'm like, wow, this is a lot of information actually. I mean, I haven't seen them because my university was quite small, so we didn't attract that much attention. But bigger universities, they usually know the handlers, they know what they look like, they know when they come around. So yeah, a lot of stories when you start talking about that. By the way, carrying a knife is not a good idea because it can be used against you. I discovered it's better to go into like martial arts.
Funny fact, when we talk about self-defense, my mother insisted the first time I went to Kyrgyzstan in 2012 for an internship, she insisted of me taking a pepper spray with me, which can be problematic because actually you're not allowed to take a pepper spray into your checked-in bag, but it went through. But yeah, it's interesting how we try to protect ourselves with physical weapons, right? And then again, with pepper sprays as well, if you have them too long, they might not work anymore. Or if you press on it, they can explode, so you can harm yourself again. So yeah, I agree with you. Martial arts would be better. And yeah, what I found really useful in my case as well is pretend to not speak the language, to play very dumb, trying to avoid it. And yeah, and I was also very, very lucky. I was very, very lucky. I'm very lucky. And I mean, one of the reasons why I'm not going back at the moment, for example, to the region is because of my stalker, for example. So he hasn't contacted me yet, but I know he's closely following anything I'm doing. So it's a very, yeah, it's something we have to talk more about, and we really have to organize more workshops and, yeah, open and honest discussions in any kind of context, not just Central Asia. So do we have any more questions for the audience, or do the speakers want to say something more about the letters, if they would have done something different, what they have learned from the experience maybe of writing the chapters? Are there laws in the area about stalking? That's a very good question, Catherine. So this depends really on the country. I found out in Switzerland if cyberstalking is not criminalized. The only thing in my canton, because Switzerland is organized in federalistic terms, kind of similar to the US system. In my region, the authorities basically say that you have to remind the stalker that he's not allowed to stalk you anymore. Which is kind of strange, right? You don't want to talk to your stalker. And basically it's only when he physically basically attacks you that you can do something against it in Switzerland. So, and I think in Central Asia it's very similar, because I mean the sexual harassment as well is not criminalized in any Central Asian country at the moment. Or if it is not enough criminalized, so that, yeah. Like when I was giving a similar talk at another university in the US, a gentleman from Uzbekistan came after the call, after the discussion, and he was offering me as well that when I go back to Uzbekistan, he would ask his family to look and protect me, which I found very nice. So yeah, bodyguard would definitely be something. It's a Central Asian region. I'm quite taken back. Yeah, that's very interesting. That's very interesting, this kind of strong masculine sense of appearance in this region. And I completely agree. We need more research on masculinity and anxious masculinities in Central Asia, but also in other contexts, right? To talk more about this, in particular, if we want to tackle gender-based violence and gender-based discrimination, we need to talk more to men to figure out what has gone bad or what has gone wrong or what has triggered this aspect of violence, right? So now I quickly want to give every speaker let's say, 30 seconds to say something before we close the round table. Aijan, would you like to start? Since we started with you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you sort of gently dragged me into this, Jasmine, but I quite enjoyed the journey. And I really enjoyed exploring it and talking about this to other people. And I realized actually, especially in political science, people are like Central Asian men, even though they're women sometimes. They're very close, very reserved, and they prefer not to talk about this. And it feels like if we start talking about this, we're going to touch upon too many traumas. So, but I'm going to dig into this, and I actually applied to do a tiny research project, explore it a bit more, and maybe even interview people. So if anybody would like to be interviewed, please let me know, because I don't have the questions yet, but I would like to continue at least for one more piece of paper, analytical paper, and maybe go beyond my personal experiences and try to anonymously, of course, and confidentially cover experiences of my colleagues in Central Asia as well. Thank you.
Alexa?
Yeah, so thanks again for inviting me. Also for inviting me to be a part of the this edited piece. Also, I think I ended up in the piece as we were having brunch, I think, as well. And you came to San Francisco once, Jasmine. So, but yeah, and if I had something, I to your question before about saying something to your younger self or your younger academic self, I think I've been able to say that in this piece. And like I said, kind of just lay it to bed at this point. But also it has me thinking about, my different experiences across Central Asia. So not just in Kyrgyzstan, but how things change when I'm in Almaty, for example. And thinking about more contemporary examples, I think of like Afro-Kazakhs and the larger African diaspora that's in Kazakhstan and how they experience their own Blackness in that space and how that's different from mine. So that's kind of opened up, this piece has opened up that question for me even more. So thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin and Aijan, for inviting me to join this fascinating journey. It was indeed very fascinating for me because partially, even though I have been reading the literature, it was my first undertaking as such, and I sometimes had to face some uncomfortable questions, which was again posed by myself. The questions that were maybe silenced for a long year. So it was, from that perspective, indeed very fascinating journey, and I would love to continue this journey. So, and I would also like to call our participants today, if they are interested in such contributions, they may find this or that chapter very interesting. This is very diverse. These are very diverse chapters, and maybe they will find something interesting also relating to their experience there. So thank you very much, Aijan and Yasmin.
So then I just want to say thank you to all the authors, for those who are here publicly, for those who are here not publicly. And yeah, and I just want to say thank you to the OSCE Academy as well, again, for funding this project. This is really important. The reason why it is open access is only thanks to the OSCE Academy for believing in our project from the very start. And yeah, and again, thank you to the Central Asia Program for having us today. This is not going to be the last event where we talk about this book. So there's going to be some other events. So if in case you want to hear other authors speaking about it, watch out for Aijan, for Alexa, but also Aziz's posts and everything. And yeah, if in case you're interested to do something similar, please feel always free to reach out. And as Aijan already mentioned at the beginning, I'm now the associated editor for short research notes and short content for the Central Asian Survey. So in case you're interested to write a positionality piece, research notes are the perfect space to do so. So always interested to hear more about it, and I'm looking forward to fruitful discussions and fruitful debates and hopeful fruitful collaborations in the future. And I wish you all happy holiday season. Take care, and hopefully talk to you soon. Bye.